Yo, yo, what's going on? Yo, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here. Um, Today we're gonna talk about the comments that Senate Majority Leader or Minority Leader Mitch McConnell made a couple of days ago when asked by the reporters at Latino Rebels if this failure to pass the John Lewis Voter Rights Act if it doesn't pass through Congress, what this could mean for um, voters of color. And basically, his response was, "I don't know what you're talking about. African Americans vote just in the same amount as regular Americans." Now, a lot of people are up in arms about this regular Americans comment because of the way it was framed. Regular Americans to him, of course, is European Americans, white Americans. You know what I mean? So he was trying to exclude other races and other ethnicities from the grand scheme of things. Meanwhile, this John Lewis Voting Rights Act is exactly what that kind of attitude is exactly what the John Lewis Voter Rights Act is trying to counteract. The kind of attitude that is exclusionary, the kind of attitude that uh, doesn't accurately paint the mosaic that is American culture. That just says, oh, it's only uh, one type of American culture, and just the English culture or the Scottish culture or the Irish culture from the culture deriving from the British Isles, and completely disregards the achievements of the African American community, the Latino community, and the Asian community. But specifically, this is targeting, I think, because of the John Lewis um, Voter Rights Act legislation, trying to guarantee the rights of voters of color. That is an insult. But Mitch McConnell, excuse me, is Mitch McConnell, and he does this stuff a lot. You know what I mean? He was a man born in Sheffield, Alabama. You know, way back in the 1930s or 40s. He's a man that he grew up his political career in Kentucky. He's a man of his environment, a man of his time. But one of the things that was crazy to me, see, back in the day, like in the Lee Atwater days and that kind of stuff, like when Ronald Reagan was running for president or George H.W. Bush was running for president, and even George W. Bush, and even up until before Donald Trump, you always had a lot of Republicans that would say racist stuff, say racist slick shit, but they would try to hide it from the general public. They didn't want the general public to know what their real intentions were. We talked a lot about on this channel about how they used um, the Southern strategy in the 1960s to guarantee to guarantee uh, wins in those old democratic states that were all southern states that were states that seceded from the Union way back in the Civil War. How they used racist coded language, dog whistle language, to guarantee the votes of those of the white poor before. From 1968 onward, that's how Nixon uh, won in '68. That's again how Ronald Reagan won in 1980. He started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. There's no I mean, it doesn't take a rocket genius to figure out that Philadelphia, Mississippi was the spot of three slain civil rights leaders during Freedom Summer in 1964. So this is nothing new. This coded language, this language of exclusion, this is something that has been going on. Look at George W. Bush's campaign in 1988 when he used Willie Horton. He made Willie Horton, and the fact that Willie Horton got to go out on leave in prison, he made it seem like because of that, the Democrats were soft on crime. And immediately in people's minds, it goes from crime statistics to racial statistics right away, just because of the pictures and the imagery and the words that they're using. So, um, this is nothing new, but the only difference I think now in the post 2016 era, and post Trump, is now they've taken the gloves off. Now they are no longer pretending. I think during the George W. Bush era from 2000 to 2008, they kind of, wanted you to believe, well, Republicans, they might not be for all these social programs that benefit minorities, or might not be for an increase in immigration, a decrease in immigration restrictions that support minorities in the Southwest, but they still, are for treating everyone equally. They're still for living up to the ethos of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that all men are created equal, endowed but they're created with certain unalienable rights, right? But now they're no longer trying to pretend that. Now it's like they've gone back to the George Wallace days, and the Strom Thurmond days, when they're like, you know what we're gonna do here is we are gonna restrict the rights of people, and we are going to prevent them from voting, because as we saw with the 2020 election, and as we know from American history, even beyond race, take it to an economic situation. When Andrew Jackson came in the 1820s, and he expanded the vote to include the poor whites, because originally, when the founding fathers designed the country, it was only for land owning white men. So he comes in the 1820s, and he expands the vote to include poor white men. Then, after the Civil War, it expands to include African Americans. Then, after the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, it expands to include women. And then in the 1960s, the 24th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. So each time, it only benefits the left wing, because the left wing pushes for democratic reforms, for changes, and for modifications to the society, and for progressivism and progressive causes, while the Republican side, or the right wing side, even before it was the Republican side, before the switch, still the conservative Democrats, when they were on the right wing in general pushes for either the status quo, or they push for to turn back the clock and go back in time. They are reactionaries, whereas the left frames themselves as revolutionaries. The right wing has been always framed as reactionary. That's the origins of the split between the right and the left, that has its origins in the first French Revolution of 1789. So it's no surprise here that he is appealing to that. He's trying to he and the Democrats are trying to not have this John Lewis voting rights act passed through Congress because he wants less people to vote. He wants to restrict the rights of the citizens in voting because they saw the largest voter turnout in American history in 2020 when Joe Biden was elected president. Now, you might say, in your opinion, might be, well, yeah, but the reason why that was is because we did a lot of mail in voting. If we had to have gone out and voted, like we have done in every other election, it wouldn't have been a large turnout. But each year, that's true, but each year, we adapt our society and our culture to technology. Now, because of COVID 19, we've seen a lot of telehealth appointments, a lot of the use of technology to achieve our ends and achieve our goals. So why shouldn't uh, why shouldn't voting be the same thing? Sure, Thomas Jefferson said that the only way that a democracy can survive is with an informed electorate. But that's why we got to educate the people more on civics. We got to educate the people more on the democratic process and what are the political differences and what are the real life ramifications of uh, voting for one side or voting for the other. What do the parties actually believe? Because I think that a lot of people get caught up in um, you know, team picking or political gangbang, as it were. You know what I mean? Like they'll say, "Oh, well, I only vote for the Democrats because of this and this and this reason," but they don't, or they get caught up in uh, one issue politics. Like say they're only for overturning Roe v. Wade, or they're only for preserving Roe v. Wade, or they're only for um, LGBT rights, and they're only for this thing or for that thing, or they're for restricting immigration, or they're against restricting immigration, or they're for um, the tough on crime bill, or they're against the tough on crime bill. Either way, if you're just voting for one issue and one issue only, you're going to miss the larger picture. One of the things I think, and this is what Chris Rock had always pointed out in the 90s, right, in his comedy bit, he said, I'm conservative on some things and I'm liberal on other things. And that's what people miss is that just, okay, say I am for preserving the Second Amendment, but I am also preserving Roe v. Wade. So where would that put me? You know what I'm saying? Would it put me in the conservative camp that is for preserving 2A, but against overturning Roe v. Wade, or would that put me in a liberal camp that is against 2A? If I vote for the liberals, they're going to take away the Second Amendment rights and uh, push for tougher gun restrictions or tougher laws. And I've always felt that the founding fathers were right in their move, towards establishing the Second Amendment, because just because we've seen in history what can happen to an unarmed populace at the hands of a tyrant. We've seen that with Mao. We've seen that with Pol Pot. We've seen that with Hitler. We've seen that with Joseph Stalin. All throughout history, when these dictators, and modern times too, when these dictators establish these governments, we've seen how they begin to take the rights away and they begin to take the freedoms away, and they restrict speech and they restrict movement and they restrict choice. So McConnell could be doing that. And of course, they all are trying to do that in a way. Because even those that afford 2A, right? If you think that they afford 2A to benefit you, then they're not. They're not. Because if you go back in history, like to 1966, right, when the Black Panthers were established, uh, the Mulford Act in California itself, when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, he was trying to take away, he, a Republican, was trying to take away the gun rights of African Americans. You know what I mean? So that you gotta be careful because you're a big, say if you're a big 2A advocate, you don't really realize that, yeah, you're advocating for 2A rights, but they don't see you in that light. They don't see you as deserving of the same slice of the American pie as them because they believe, especially Mitch McConnell, whose ancestry goes all the way back to Scots Irish immigrants um, in the Revolutionary War. Well, I got news for him. A lot of African Americans' ancestry goes back further than that. I have other videos on this channel proving the connection of the so-called African American community to a lot of indigenous cultures. And we all know with the 1619 Project, it is shedding light on what life was like in colonial times for the descendants of Africans, the descendants of enslaved and kidnapped Africans as well as indigenous people. Don't think that a lot of African American heritage doesn't go back to the indigenous people or a lot of Latino heritage. We all know the Latino heritage tied in with the Aztecs, tied in with the Mayans, tied in with the Incas, tied in with the Taínos, goes all the way back to the indigenous Americans. So Mitch McConnell and them are Johnny come latelys, so I wouldn't really listen to anything they have to say as far as the true Americans, but I would say that all these democratic rights that we now enjoy, they could be taken away from us in a generation because, um, you know, hey Lisa, hey Lisa finally jumped on the live. Hey Lisa, what's going on? It can be taken away from us in a generation. Within a generation, we can all lose it if we're not careful, if we're not politically aware, if we're not politically savvy. People say that it doesn't really matter. That's cool, Lise. It's cool. People say that it doesn't really matter, who you vote for. Oh, they're all the same, right? They're all, in the pocket of corporate lobbyists or corporate interests. That's not necessarily true because Frogman, Turtle Man, exactly. Um, because look at this. Okay, say for example, you took the voting rights for granted, right? You took them for granted, and then the Republicans and the right wing swoop in and they take away those rights. Then you ain't gonna have a choice. So then you're gonna sit there wishing you had a choice and wishing that you chose when the time was right. But you didn't take the time, you didn't take the effort to educate yourself on what the different parties believe, what are the political philosophies, what are the histories of these political parties, because you got a lot of people like Candace Owens, again, will always come on here and say, well, the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, so why are majority of Black Americans voting for the Democrats, right? But they don't bother again to tell you, okay, that was the Civil War. What happened in between the Civil War that caused the parties to switch, especially modern history in the 1960s? Why is it that we look at a political map from, say, the 2020 election or the 2016 election, or the 2008 election, or the 2012 election, in every single southern state that either was a Confederate state or was a slave state in the Union, like Kentucky, like Mitch McConnell state, is red, and every single liberal state is blue. If what Candace and the other Republicans are trying to push is true. And Mitch McConnell thinks, Frogman thinks, that by touting his lineage back to the first Scots-Irish settlers in the American Revolution. Okay, because Lisa, that's true. That's a good point Lisa brings up. Why isn't there that's what the John Lewis Voters' Right Act is trying to secure. The John Lewis bill is trying to secure that African Americans and all other Americans in perpetuity, which means in the future, never have this issue again. But they're not going to pass it through, because here's what this comment reveals. This comment reveals the truth about the intention of the United States. The intention of the United States by the founders, again, we go back to the beginning of the video when I talked about how the founders only really intended voting to be for land-owning white men only. And over the years, it was expanded first to poor white men, then to African Americans, and then to women, and then back to African Americans, because even though it was enshrined in the Constitution in the 15th Amendment, they were doing all kinds of other shenanigans like they're doing right now. To take it down, they would have things like the grandfather clause. Well, you can only vote if your grandfather voted. Well, if I'm African American and I was a slave, my grandfather was a slave, how can he have voted? You know what I mean? So I'm already defeated on that front as it is. You know, so, or they would put in a poll tax, right? If you couldn't pay this particular tax in the South, you couldn't vote. So then they would be able to say, well, we're not telling them, we're not in violation of the 15th Amendment. We're not telling them they can't vote. We just tell them, in order to vote, you got to pay this tax. Well, they knew that the community was poor, so they could never pay that tax. Or they'll put in a test, you know, like I guess a civics test or a government type test or even a writing test. But of course, the former slaves were at a disadvantage because they weren't taught to read and write. So I'm going to lose. The system is rigged against me the way they put it in. So because of that, African Americans then had to fight again in the 1960s. It's like, okay, me as a disabled person or Lisa as a disabled individual, it would be like if they said, y'all can vote. Nobody is saying you can't, but you gotta pass this physical. Now, depending on what they test us on physically, there's no way that we would be able to pass that because of the disadvantages that we already face. So, there's no way that we can win. And they do that in New York City here, not with the voting, but they do it here a lot with housing. They'll tell us, oh, there's a lot of low income housing for people with disabilities. Okay, but The housing lottery, the housing connect, the lottery that they get us on is more than we can afford that is given to us by SSI, right? So they know there's no possible way we can ever get into that housing. They're just setting us up for failure from the very beginning, from the jump, right? And that's exactly what they did in the South after the 15th. Well, that's an interesting question, and I kind of answered it before, but I'll elaborate on it again. The more people that vote, if you have a large voter turnout, more than likely, the winner is going to be a Democrat because Democrats have policies in place more so that benefit the general population of the major cities. And plus, Democrats are the majority in the major cities in America, in urban Chicago or urban New York or urban Los Angeles. Democrats tend to be in the major cities. Republicans tend to be in the rural parts of these specific states. And remember, too, that Democrats are putting in policies that benefit uh, people with disabilities, the LGBT, the poor. This has always been the mission statement of the Democrats, especially on the poor, even since the establishment of the Democratic Party in the 1820s by Andrew Jackson. It was Andrew Jackson who first expanded the rights of voting or suffrage to the poor. And then it was other liberals and other progressives in both parties that pushed for the reforms, to make society more equal. So what he knows, Lisa, and we all know this implicitly. We all know deep down inside implicitly that the more people that vote, the chances are the larger the voter turnout in general, the chances are that a Democrat will win the election because there's more Democrats than there is Republicans. Look at 2020, hugest voter turnout in history, and Biden. Look at 2008, another huge voter turnout, and Obama won the election. Look at 2016, not a lot of people voted. People set that one out because they didn't like Hillary Clinton and a Republican. So when less people vote, Republicans are likely to get in because their population is smaller and their population is more rural. When more people vote, the Democrats are likely to get in because their population is larger and their population is more city based. So that's what he's afraid of. He knows that if you restrict the voting to just white people or restrict the voting to just white men, more than likely it's going to be Republicans are going to win the election. Less people that vote, it's going to be Republicans. More people that vote is going to be Democrats. So that's the reason why. And he wants to restrict it when it comes to African Americans because out of all the other minority groups, African Americans don't really vote Republican, and the reason is obvious. You know, people want to act stupid and dumb, or should I say, obtuse. You know what I mean? Like, oh, well, why they only vote one party? Why they don't give the other party a chance? Well, duh, because the other party says things like this. you know, they say things like this, and people know the history of how the parties switched sides and how the Republicans used the Southern strategy again in 1968 to get those poor white voters who were historical Democrats onto the side of them. Nobody is stupid. Nobody is that dumb to believe. No, there's no term limits in the Senate. He said so he could keep running as long as they elect him. And his state is Kentucky. His state is the bluegrass state, so they love him. And you know what's crazy? They consider him a moderate Republican. He's a moderate. So if he's a moderate, what is a left winger? I mean, what? Excuse me. What is a right winger? If he's moderate, then what is a conservative? If he is like that's like saying Billy Graham, rest his soul, was a moderate Christian. Well, if he's a moderate, then who's an extremist? You know, like if that's what you consider as a moderate, I think they consider him a moderate because he didn't like Trump. You know what I mean? Like so that makes him a moderate. But in fact, if you look at it politically, besides okay, people hate Trump because of the Capitol invasion, 2021 Capitol invasion, January 6th, whatever, and other reasons. But if you look at it as far as policy wise, Trump was more moderate, than McConnell. McConnell is more dyed in the wool, conservative, southern based. A northern based Republican, or what they call as a Rockefeller Republican, um, a northern Republican like Trump is a moderate Republican compared to the southern Republicans. So I think that's why they call him a moderate. I don't know, but to me, he's a hardcore conservative. Ain't nothing moderate about him. What makes him a moderate? Just the fact you didn't get along with Trump, but who got him? Who in the Senate got along with Trump at all? On either side, none of the sides liked him. You know what I mean? He's a political outsider. So you can't really judge them on that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, he didn't sign off on the other stimulus that Trump wanted to do, but of course not. That makes him more of a hardcore Republican. Mhm. Right. Yeah, I'm not making it up, Lisa. I actually looked up in that article you sent me where they call him a moderate. In that article, I'm like, well, he's a moderate. Like, shoot, what does that make Candace Owens? What does that make Ben Shapiro? They're a fascist then, right? They're Hitler level, right? They're KKK level. If he's a moderate, then you know what I mean? They must be an extremist, right? Crazy. And he's been in there for mad long. That's another thing. Like, there needs to be, yeah, like I said, moderate to them is that he was against Trump, but they all were. All the Democrats and all the Republicans were all against Trump. So, I mean, the whole political establishment was against him. Everybody was against him. So that means all the Republicans are moderate. Marco Rubio is a moderate. Ted Cruz is a moderate. Um, Anybody that wasn't in that pro Trump camp is a moderate to them. But he's no moderate to me. He's more to the right of Trump. He's more of a Republican than even Trump is. Yeah, he needs to retire. He's almost 80 years old. But see, that's the thing with the Senate, Lise, is that the Senate is composed of a lot of older men. You know what I mean? And a lot of them have very old and antiquated ideas about government. In fact, that's what the word Senate means in Latin. The original Senate was the Senate in Rome, and the Senate in Rome was completely composed of the elders of society. But the problem is, the elders of society, they don't know what's going on today. You know what I mean? They don't know what is going on with the people, and they don't adapt to change. So, although the word Senate might derive from older men, we live in a different society. We live in a more pluralistic society. So I agree, get the old men out of here. And it's not about old or young because, hey, I voted for Joe Biden. He's pretty on the older side. But if you're not going to make the right decisions and you're not going to do what is right for the majority of the populace, because as quiet as it's kept, guys, America is becoming really progressively becoming a non-white society. There is, yeah, absolutely. Lisa said all he needs to do is wear the white sheet to claim his racism status. Exactly. I mean, but see, I'm not gonna sit here and act, and Lisa's not gonna sit here and act like we was surprised by this, because this man is who this man is. A man born in Sheffield, Alabama, grew up politically in Kentucky, surrounded by um, you know, those old school segregationists, those old school people that lived and died by Jim Crow, the Strom Thurmond types or the George Wallace types. It doesn't come as a surprise. It's what we expected. It's what we've been hearing and what we've been knowing about the Republican Party for decades now. But what I hate is when they try to come with the so-called moderate Democrats. I mean, excuse me, moderate Republicans like Mitt Romney, right? And they say, "Oh, well, look, the party has changed, right? We're now embracing more minorities. We're now embracing African Americans or Mexican Americans or other groups that they before put into legal legislation to guard against. I mean, uh, actual laws that discriminated against these specific groups, especially African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans. Like, depending on the region of the country that you were in, that was the group that got discriminated against, got hunted down, got killed by the KKK that was there. Obviously, American history focuses a lot on the South and the story of African American discrimination, but there's another story of Mexican American discrimination in the Southwest, where there's a story of Native American, obviously, discrimination in places like Oklahoma, you know? So when it comes to those three groups, there has been legal legislation on the books against those three groups by the Republican Party. So And I'm glad that critical race theory is coming into existence in the schools. And I'm glad that we are now finally breaking that code and learning about the truth about American history. That American history, yeah, is not all innocent and not all cut and dry like people think. There is mad stuff that went on, you know, and we hardly ever learned about what Plessy versus Ferguson meant in society in 1894. We never hardly learn about Brown versus Board of Ed. We never learn about these historic court cases in the Southwest, like Hernandez versus the state of Texas. And the critical race theory thing, Hernandez versus state of Texas in 1954, or Mendez versus Manchester in 1954, that ended segregation for Mexican Americans. But anyway, critical race theory, at least from my understanding, looks at America from a different point of view, a different perspective, the perspective of the disadvantaged class, the perspective of minorities, rather than the perspective of the white majority. So it breaks down history in a different perspective, in a different point of view, because we've always really learned about history from a white person's point of view. And now that it's becoming a majority minority country, we need to start learning it from the other side of it. Hopefully, they can apply this to world history as well. But they're right now just talking about it in terms of U.S. history, and that's a good thing because, of course, everything in American history is going to look triumphant in the eyes of the majority of the American people, right? They're going to paint people in American history that were terrible people as good people. People like Robert E. Lee, people like P.T. Beauregard, people like Stonewall Jackson, Andrew Jackson. They're going to paint them as good guys. They're going to say what they did was good. Look, when we learned American history, when I was a kid in school, we learned about manifest destiny, right? We learned that manifest destiny, the belief that America should spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, was a good thing, and that we didn't learn about the Mexican American War. We didn't learn about the Indian Wars and how heavy the Indian Wars were to the Native Americans, and how even Abraham Lincoln, somebody that was looked at as a hero in American history, was not at first. He was not. First off, he was not really an abolitionist. He really was ambivalent, and he really didn't care about ending slavery. His main objective, and he said it during the Lincoln Douglas debates, his main objective was to preserve the Union. Secondly, we never learned what he did to the American Indians during the Lakota massacre in the 1860s in order to build the Trans-Pacific Railroad. So even with the Trans-Pacific Railroad, we learned that as a triumphant thing, that it was a good thing that they built the Trans-Pacific Railroad, that we don't ever learn about how many Native American nations and how many Native American groups suffered to build that Trans-Pacific Railroad, or how they brought the Chinese over to build it, and it was the Chinese peasants whose blood built that Trans-Pacific Railroad. We also, when we learn things like Pocahontas in history, we learn that John Smith was a heroic person. That John Smith was a hero in history, but we never really learn what John Smith and his people, how they massacred the Powhatan Nation, how they literally wiped out the Powhatan Nation, how Pocahontas was raped by John Smith and his men and taken captive back to England as a slave. And we don't even really know, and she was only 12 years old, we don't even really know if the marriage between her and her husband, John Rolfe, another English settler, was even consensual. Could have been rape, right? But we never really learned that in American history. We we just learned, hey, John Smith was a good guy. He he landed with the English colonists in 1607 and he established the Jamestown colony. Oh, that's great, right? No. So critical race theory takes a look at all the events of American history and didacts them down from a different point of view. It takes a critical look at race and the role that race has played in shaping American society, American culture, because yep, exactly, Lisa. That book, 1619 Project. And people are saying that it demonizes, people are saying that books like that demonize white people or makes white people think, less of themselves in American history. Well, what about when they teach Hispanic kids or Hispanic young people that we didn't have a history before the Spaniards landed here in 1492? What about when they teach African Americans that they didn't have a history before slavery? Didn't that make them feel less of? Didn't that make them feel, didn't that affect their emotional self esteem, their self perception of themselves as children learning that? When you look at a wall and you look at, um, you see George Washington, you see Abraham Lincoln, you see all of them, and you see the John Smiths of the world, the Christopher Columbuses of the world, all these white men that we worship in American society that are the saints of American culture, that are the saints of Western culture, and we never see ourselves. Didn't you think that affected our self esteem as well? How we never learned about the Aztecs, we never learned about the Mayans really in depth. We never learned about the Incas. We never learned that there was a Tupac before the Tupac we knew that passed away in 1996 that fought against the Spaniards in the 1500s in Peru, for the rights of indigenous people in Peru. We never learned um, that there was a Mansa Musa who was the richest man in all of history, and he was from Africa, and that he was so rich in gold that when he went to Egypt, the price of gold dropped because he had so much of it that it wasn't worth the same thing. It was major inflation. We never learned about that in world history at all. We learned, or we came up in both class and in regular life thinking that Africa, because of movies like Tarzan and stuff, Africa was a backwater place, an unsophisticated place, uh, a dark continent. We learned that the Americas, where Latinos have their origins, that it was a backwater place, that it didn't have no culture, it didn't have no language, it didn't have no sophistication, it didn't have mathematics, it didn't have reading. It was just a backwater place. Everything in world history is Eurocentric to the point that even in Bible class, now the religion of Christianity, like the religion of Islam or like the religion of Judaism, spoke about this yesterday in the Regina King video, originates in the Middle East, which is closer to Africa and closer to the darker people of the world than to the white people of the world. But yet we still see all the luminaries and all the important people associated with Christianity and other religions painted as like they lived in Norway, or they lived in Sweden, right? When we know from the Bible in the book of Exodus that Moses was in Egypt, that Jesus was exiled in Egypt in the New Testament. Out of Egypt I shall call my son. And that is not to disrespect, the contributions of European Americans or European society, the Western society, the people that Mitch McConnell calls the true Americans, the real Americans. He's not the first person to say that. Even in the Republican Party, Sarah Palin said it back in the late 2000s. Not to disrespect them. Listen, the presidents, I know them all by heart. I know all their names. I know everything about them. The antecedents of Western culture, I know all about it. But all that we're saying is let's learn about a different side of it. Let's learn a different aspect of it. Let's learn the missing links to the puzzle. Let's learn something we didn't. Let's not keep rehashing the same exact things that we already know and worshiping the same exact people that we already know about that are just part of white supremacy. We're doing it already in pop culture. We're seeing Encanto coming out in Disney. We're seeing diversity in the pop culture world, even in the WWE, even with WWE champions and stuff. So why can't we see it with knowledge? Why can't we see it with learning about history? Why can't we take a critical look at what we know about as American history and spin it around with a different perspective? That's all we're asking. Tell a different side of it. Tell the other side. That's all we were asking. They were asking about it in terms of science years ago when the Republicans and the conservatives didn't want to teach evolution, right? So they came up with intelligent design because they wanted to teach, their side of it. There was really creationism, but their point of, their spin on it. So they came up with intelligent design. They used to say, well, keep it fair. You know what I mean? Keep it spit both sides, speak both sides of it, speak the creationist side and the evolutionist side, and keep it fair. Don't just speak the evolutionist side as if it's facts and there ain't no other side to it. You know what I mean? Because there's another side to it. Well, why can't they take that approach? They're going to take that approach with science and then, of course, politicize it. Why can't they take that approach with history as well? Don't treat us like we wasn't there. You know what I mean? Don't treat us like we wasn't part of the story, because we was. And they do it in every aspect of history, not just American history. Yeah, they are ashamed of it, Lisa. But in Lisa says they're ashamed of it. That's why they're deleting it, like with Disney and stuff, and HBO Max going back and deleting it. But listen, in your life as a person, right? The things you did in your life as a person can never be deleted. It can never be undone. It is what it is. It's there. It's a fact. And you have to, in therapy, they always teach you these coping mechanisms, these coping techniques that you have to um you have to face up to your past and you have to own up to your past. And there's no way you can move forward without first treating your past, without first dealing with your past issues and past baggages. So if that works collectively, if that works, I mean that works individually, then that has to work collectively as well. If you have to do that with a person, you have to do that with a society too. You can't move forward into a new reality and just act like the past doesn't exist. Like there is a lot of things about ancient civilizations. People learn about ancient civilizations, right? Like Egypt, Rome, Greece, and stuff. And there is a lot of unsavory things that they did that our modern society doesn't agree with. The Egyptians engaged in incest, the Greeks engaged in pedophilia, the Romans engaged in pedophilia and rape. But we're not going to sit here and try to apply our modern day ethics to it and act like it didn't happen or act like it never existed, because then we're not dealing with the issue. And that's not even, those civilizations are not even relevant to our modern day struggle. So just like an individual's history, a society's history has to be the same thing. You can't deal with you can't deal with the present or try to conquer your demons in the present without first dealing with the past, without first learning. You can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. Without first knowing what caused this. You know what I mean? What caused our society to be so racially fragmented, so much racial division? What caused every single thing in our society to be looked at through a racial lens? And I mean every single thing, down to the whack 100 thing, down to little things like, uh, Pocahontas portrayal in Disney, or down to the way Aladdin is portrayed in Disney, down to the way, everything. We always see, even myself included, people always see even the littlest things, even the inconsequential things through a racial lens in our society, because that's the way our society is structured. So you have to deal with why our society is the way it is before you begin to heal the society. Look at Martin Luther King Jr., for example. He was very critical of American society. So it's critical to the point that that's why they didn't want to give him his own holiday in the 80s, and that's probably why they killed him. You know what I mean? Because he was critical of America. He was critical of how America had failed the black man and woman, specifically. Now, did he sit up there and say, well, okay, yeah, fuck Washington, fuck John Adams, fuck Thomas Jefferson, fuck Martin Van Buren, all those presidents? No, he didn't sit there and do that. But he did call out America on their bullshit past and their bullshit present. And you have to examine an issue with critical lens if you're going to deal with an issue accurately. You have to look at both sides and the middle, because history and things that deal with society, social issues, and current events, they are not just one-sided. They are multi-sided. Take, for an example, something like in the ancient Greek battle of Thermopylae, right? That was a battle between um, the Greeks and the Persians that was covered in the movie 500. The Persians, from their point of view, they were just taking over land. From the Greeks' point of view, they were defending land. Now, some would say, like we do in the West, that the Greek society was more just, the Greek society was more democratic, the Greek society was more eclectic, but that wasn't necessarily true. The Greeks all looked at non-Greeks as Hanoi, all looked at non-Greeks as less than human. You know what I mean? The Persians didn't look at non-Persians like that. Otherwise, they wouldn't allow the Jews to return and build the second temple after the Babylonian exile in the Bible. So Lisa is 100% correct that even Disney doesn't want to deal with their reckoning. Disney doesn't want to deal with their past. Movies like Song of the South that Walt Disney himself stood by, Walt Disney himself endorsed, he supported, because he grew up on those tales as a kid from Missouri, and he stood by it. And now the Disney company is trying to wipe it away like it didn't happen. Same thing with the WWE. You see that a lot on Peacock. Since they moved to Peacock, you start to see a lot of the stuff that was from the WWE, like Vince McMahon saying the N-word in 2005 and other shit like that, is now removed from the network, and people are going to pretend like it didn't happen. You got to remember why we study history. What is the point, people will say, of studying these past events of these people that are no longer alive, or something that happened even 2 or 3 years ago, even if it is alive? What is the point of re-examining these past events and these past injustices? It is so that we don't have it happen again, because those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I think in our human nature, we're doomed to repeat it anyway, even if we study it meticulously, but that's a whole nother issue. So yeah, they want to erase things and pretend like it didn't happen. And because they want to erase it in 100 years or 200 years, if they continue down this process, it'll be like it never really happened. And then we'll be doing it all over again, unfortunately, at least. So. But as far as Mitch McConnell, he is exposing a naked truth of the Republican Party, and a naked truth that a lot of people feel, even around the world. Like, you ask them to present to you an American icon, they'll probably present to you somebody who has blonde hair, blue eyes, somebody that is white, because that to them is the face of America. Meanwhile, America is such a more diverse nation, and many African American ancestors are indigenous to this continent, and many African American, and many, of course, no white people are indigenous to this continent. Even if they came here during colonial times when we were still under the British, still they came here from European countries. We know that. You know what I mean? There were some black people who did not come over during the transatlantic slave trade. There were some black people that were indigenous to the North American continent. Read the book by Ivan Van Sertima that came before Columbus. You want to know more about that, the indigenous, the black indigenous, and the Olmec heads that we never really learned about in American history. And there are Latinos who are indigenous. In fact, most Latinos are indigenous to this continent. And they didn't just come over here from, with ancestors from Spain, even though some of them did, right? In fact, there is a movie you want to check out by John Leguizamo, the actor who played Benny Blanco in the movie Carlito's Way. He has a Netflix special. I don't know if it's still on there. It was on there a couple of years ago, called Latino History for Dummies or for Morons, right? And he's breaking down the connection that Latinos have to indigenous roots, to African roots, and all that. You know what I mean? So that's something you might want to check out. And that is another thing. And of course, when Lisa brought up the 1619 Project, all this stuff proving that Mitch McConnell is wrong, that his Scots-Irish ancestors, by the way, who were discriminated against by Edward Longshanks, Edward the First of Britain, right? In the 13th century, ironically turned around and discriminated against not only Irish Catholics but Native Americans as well. Isn't that crazy how that works out? So he's wrong. It's not just, well, white Americans are not the only Americans. There are plenty of other Americans. America is a pluralistic nation. It's like saying that all Arabic people are Muslims, even though we know that other religions and other cultures have contributed just as much in the formation of Arabian or Arab society as a Muslim religion has. We're on an equal playing field. To eliminate one is to eliminate all. That's all I wanted to say, guys. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Peace. Love y'all. And thank you, Lisa, for contributing.